In February 2022, Europe woke up to war. Missiles struck major cities. Armored columns crossed international borders. Air raid sirens echoed across Ukraine. To many, the invasion appeared sudden. But in the months leading up to it, the signs were visible. Ignored by some, underestimated by others. This is the story of how the war in Ukraine began in 2022, focusing on the final decisions, military movements, and political breakdowns that led to the largest conflict in Europe since World War II. By the start of 2022, Ukraine was already living with conflict. Since 2014, fighting had continued at a low intensity in eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Ceasefires existed on paper, but violations were frequent. At the same time, Ukraine was strengthening ties with Western countries. Russia viewed these developments as a growing security threat. Diplomatic relations between Russia, Ukraine, and the West were deteriorating. Despite this, full-scale war still seemed unlikely to many observers. That perception would soon change. In late 2021, satellite images began to raise alarms. Russia started moving large numbers of troops, tanks, artillery, and support equipment toward Ukraine's borders. This buildup occurred in multiple locations: along Ukraine's eastern border, in Crimea, in Belarus to the north of Ukraine. By early 2022, more than 100,000 Russian troops were positioned around Ukraine. Russia claimed these movements were routine military exercises. Western governments warned they were preparations for an invasion. The world watched, uncertain which interpretation was correct. As the buildup continued, diplomatic activity intensified. Meetings took place between Russian and American officials, NATO representatives, European leaders. Russia presented a series of demands, including guarantees that Ukraine would never join NATO, limits on NATO military presence in Eastern Europe. These demands were rejected. Western leaders argued that countries had the right to choose their own alliances. Talks stalled. Trust eroded further. At the same time, warnings from intelligence agencies became increasingly specific. The possibility of war was no longer theoretical. In early February 2022, fighting along the existing front lines intensified. Shelling increased. Both sides accused each other of provocation. Civilian evacuations were announced in separatist-controlled areas. Information warfare escalated alongside military activity, with competing narratives dominating international media. The situation became increasingly unstable. On February 21, 2022, a major shift occurred. Russia officially recognized the self-declared separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. Russian forces were ordered into these areas under the label of peacekeeping. This move effectively ended remaining diplomatic frameworks meant to prevent escalation. International leaders condemned the decision. Sanctions were announced. The final barriers to war were removed. In the days that followed, uncertainty turned into anticipation. Airspace restrictions were imposed. Embassies evacuated staff. Military units across Ukraine were placed on high alert. Despite this, many civilians continued daily life, hoping war could still be avoided. Then, in the early hours of February 24, 2022, that hope ended. Before dawn, explosions were reported across Ukraine. Missiles struck Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, military bases and infrastructure across the country. Russian ground forces crossed into Ukraine from multiple directions: from the north via Belarus, from the east, from the south through Crimea. The invasion was not limited to one region. It was a full-scale assault. Russia described the operation as a special military operation. Ukraine and the international community described it as an invasion. The opening phase of the war suggested a rapid campaign. Russian forces advanced quickly along major roads. Airborne units attempted to seize key locations. The apparent goal was to disable Ukrainian command structures, capture the capital, force a political collapse. However, the plan did not unfold as expected. Contrary to many predictions, Ukraine did not collapse. Ukrainian military units resisted fiercely. Logistical problems slowed advancing forces. Civilian resistance emerged alongside formal military defense. Cities held. Supply lines were strained. What was expected to be a swift operation turned into a prolonged conflict. The international response was immediate. Sanctions were imposed on Russia at an unprecedented scale. Western countries began supplying Ukraine with weapons, intelligence, and financial aid. Airspace closures, trade restrictions, and diplomatic expulsions followed. Energy markets reacted sharply. The war's impact spread far beyond Ukraine's borders. As weeks passed, it became clear the conflict would not end quickly. Fighting intensified around major cities. Civilian casualties mounted. Millions fled their homes. The initial phase of the war gave way to a grinding, large-scale conflict. The war in Ukraine began in 2022 not because of a single incident, but because diplomatic channels failed. Mutual distrust reached a breaking point. Military pressure replaced negotiation. Leaders believed force could achieve what talks could not. Once the invasion began, there was no easy path back. The war in Ukraine did not start accidentally. It was the result of deliberate choices made in an atmosphere of fear, rivalry, and miscalculation. What began in February 2022 reshaped global politics, European security, and millions of lives. And its consequences are still unfolding.